Good morning. We have an intimate collection of people today. Feel free to move up if you'd like. Welcome to the final Bainbridge Island Climate Energy Forum for this school year. We're going to be taking a hiatus for the summer. We will be back in the fall. If you have ideas for sessions that you would like us to talk about, please be in touch with any of the groups that are listed here as co-organizers of the event. We actually have a very healthy list of topics that we're already planning on, but we love to know what people are finding particularly relevant or important at the moment. There will clearly be some topics relating to the electoral process in the fall that we'll probably be having forums to discuss and help people learn more about. One of the things we try and do at the beginning is either give a little overview about what is climate change. Fortunately, the group of folks here today does not need that. But instead, the decision was that we would identify what are some of the things that are underway in the world relevant to climate change that you might not be learning about. One of the things you may not think about on a regular basis is NASA's carbon monitoring system. It's actually the way we determine how much greenhouse gas is being emitted in the United States as well as around the world. And it's a way to identify whether or not we're in compliance with international agreements. But you can say goodbye to that because the funding was cut. So we will no longer know whether or not we're verifying our compliance with Paris. The 2019 budget for this program was eliminated. Interesting story, though. The very data that we've used historically to identify how carbon dioxide levels were increasing in the atmosphere, which created the Keeling curve, has gone funded and unfunded over the past 70 years, probably about 15 or 20 times. There's a great article that overviews that. So we can hope that someone else is going to find budget money to make this happen. Interestingly enough, there's a lot of work going on in the U.S. philanthropic space to try and fund things like this. So that's a possible call for hope, but a sad thing that our federal government no longer feels that this is important science. So it was canceled due to higher priorities within the science budget. Hard to understand at this moment in time what that higher priority would be. Right, we need to explore. Another issue that happened a lot at the federal level was thinking about climate change and Department of Defense facilities. Interestingly enough, the Department of Defense was thoroughly on board with thinking about climate change. It was listed as one of the primary threats to global security. There were a lot of plans in place, not only for the facilities themselves, but for troop readiness. The final report to Congress that was recently submitted eliminated all but one reference to climate change. They removed the impact to sea level rise, Arctic sea ice melting, and any details that were in the National Climate Assessment. So that probably makes us even more vulnerable than we were before, especially if you think about how climate change is actually causing a lot of the global instability that we're now seeing in places such as Syria. So, we'll be updating you with more exciting facts like those in future events. Hopefully we'll also include some happy ones sometimes. But the point here is that we now need to look locally. The federal government is not engaging on this issue dramatically. So we need to be the change that we want to see in moving from things like this coal-fired power plant. This is Coal Strip in Montana. I gave a talk in Montana a couple months ago, and I apologized to the people of Montana for us polluting their air so that we could have electricity. They appreciated that. So we want to move from that to renewable energy future, where we're not causing that pollution, we're decreasing greenhouse gas emissions into the atmosphere, and we actually have a stable energy solution that can go forward into the future. Fossil fuels are not renewable. Fossil fuels will run out. It's not a really great system to be running on. And to that end, we have a great program today to talk about those types of future energy challenges.
Good morning, everybody. Okay, so this presentation I'm going to show you today, I made this presentation to our legislative representatives in the 26th district, which covers the greater Pierce County area and the Gig Harbor Key Peninsula. And I did this last year, just before I retired. Just to we meet with our legislative representatives once a year to do a presentation like that, just to let them know what's going on in our industry and what kind of changes are happening, and what are we looking forward to in the next legislative session. So a little bit about Peninsula Light Company myself. Peninsula Light Company is an electric cooperative. It started in 1925. It is now the 6th oldest cooperative in the United States. We buy all of our energy from the Bonneville Power Administration. You know, in the utility industry, you like to use acronyms. So if you hear me say BPA, I mean the Bonneville Power Administration. There's 9% of our energy that we don't buy from Bonneville, and that's from our wind farm that we have down in Goldendale, Washington. It's 100 megawatt or 98 megawatts. And we use our investment in that wind farm to comply with Initiative 937 that requires a portfolio standard of up to 15% by 2020. Our community had no idea how to form a cooperative. And so this gentleman, Homer Tbone, he's a very famous guy. He's known as the, kind of the father of public power in Washington State. And we hired him in 1925 to get us going. Our community and business members had no idea how to build a electric utility, not a clue. And for the first 18 months of the existence of Peninsula Light Company, they never sold 1 kilowatt of power. So they had to raise money through membership and to build out a system, electrical distribution system, before they can energize it in December of 1926. This is our service area, 2 peninsulas, 3 islands. Basically about 110 110 square miles. I wish it was 110 square feet. We have a submarine cable that feeds both Fox Island up there and a little island on the other side of the Key Peninsula called Heron Island. And about 75% of our system is undergrounded. Here's the makeup of our community. Does this look like you guys? Highly educated. We have about 50% of our membership is retired. They have a nice nest egg. Quality of life is important to them. And so they have a lot of high expectations and what they expect for power reliability and quality of life. This is our power reliability. We were down in the 4th quartile, as you can see, in 2005 and even prior to that. And we've been working hard for the last 20 years to get our reliability up to the 1st quartile. You measure power reliability in duration of minutes per customer and frequency of outages. So this has been one of our major goals with our board. I don't have the 2017 numbers. I did see them the other day. We're still in the 1st quartile.
Kitsap County is the worst of the 8 counties PSE serves. Bainbridge is worse than Kitsap County. We're the worst on their system, and it's these as reported to the WUTC.
Okay.
So Peninsula, which we're very proud of, we have 5 times the outage length and duration. I think Randall knows those numbers.
Yes, he does.
So we're 5 times as bad as they are.
And,
We're very proud of this. We didn't think we'd ever get to the 1st quartile, and it's not all due to burying the system. A lot of it has to do with some of the great work that Amy's doing on system automation and putting technology in the field so we can identify where the outages is occurring and get the crews there. So it's kind of an operational efficiency. So get talking a little bit about the future of utilities. This first 2 slides I'm going to use is from a gentleman named Professor Seba from Stanford University. He wrote a book about energy and transportation. And he claims that we're on the cusp of the greatest technological innovation since the turn of the 20th century. And he likes to use this slide to show in 1900, the 4th of July parade that they had. And he asked, can you point out, is there an automobile in there? And there is. There's 1 car in this picture. The rest is all horse and buggy. 13 years later, same parade, same street. And can you find a horse and buggy? And there is a horse and buggy. In just a short period of time, 13 years, look at the transformation on this technology that occurred. And he claims that this is where we're at today. Let's talk about electric cars. There's about a billion cars in the world. There's about 230 million cars in the United States. And this is what they're projecting for electric cars here in the future. We'll see if this holds true. But essentially, we had about 2 million electric cars. It took 10 years to get to 2 million electric cars, and they expect to double that now between 2018 and 2020. So this is projected to start to exponentiate on the purchase of cars here in the future. So if this holds true, we'll see this major transformation in technology that he's talking about. But another change that has been going on that we've noticed, and a lot of utilities have, is this is a historical view once again, looking back on our energy from 1950 through 2040. And as you can see, when the GDP, the gross domestic product, would go up, so would electricity consumption, and the inverse would happen when the economy went down. But what we have seen now is a separation of these two. This model is broken, and maybe it's good that it's broken. But as you see, energies remain flat for the last, it should show from about 2000, flat all the way out. Most utilities now are seeing either a flat load growth or no load growth. And Peninsula is experiencing the same thing. The last 6 years, we've had a flat load growth. And this is a good thing. Let me go back to that real quick. What's driving this? There are 4 key factors for driving this. Energy efficiency, of course, is the -- driver for this. The other one is state building code standards nationwide, as well as appliance standards. We've also moved from an economy of doing heavy manufacturing and also consumer awareness. So this is a trend that we're going to continue to see, and it's a trend that concerns utilities because they were so used to seeing an increase in growth as economy changed. Now utilities are going to have less revenue to be able to maintain their systems, and they're going to have to rethink the business model. Also, part of this could be as well as due to renewable energies.
What about the electric vehicle and charging an electric vehicle?
That's a good question. So we did some load profiling on electric vehicles in our service area. They use about 400 kilowatt hours a month, which times our rate, let's say 8 cents a kilowatt, that would be, what, $32 a month. So I've told my board when I met with them and showed them the load profiling that we're doing on electric vehicles, if you think this is going to save you, it's not. 10 years from now, you'll get when you get 10,000 cars, then we can talk about it. But we're going to have to really transform this market before you start to see some energy revenue coming in from electric vehicles. So let's take a look at the West Coast, because what's going on in the West Coast is going to impact you right here in your community and throughout the Pacific Northwest. So the Western Electric Coordinating Council, there we go. So this is the area that I'm talking about, from Canada, the provinces, all the way down here, a little bit into Mexico. They coordinate the sale of power throughout the western region, from Bonneville to California, parts of Mexico and Canada. That power is traded every day. They have to shape it. They have to figure out how much power they need to bring in the system, and they have to schedule it. And then they look at the pricing. So what I want to show you here is the amount of renewable energy that is coming into this area. This includes, of course, the Pacific Northwest. And a lot of it's coming from California. And here, in this little chart here, I'm showing you what the California standard is going to be for renewable up through 2030. They have a standard of 50% by 2030. And they're looking at 100% by 2045 if they pass the legislation. So just take a look here at the increase of the amount of renewable energy that we see entering the market here on the West Coast. Now, let's take a look. If there's one thing I want you to take away today is this slide. You can go home, Google the duck curve. What's important to understand about this curve is that you got all this solar energy that's dumping into the market during the day when we don't need that energy, right? Energy usage is very low during the day because everybody's at work, kids are at school, and guess what? Around 4 o'clock, people come home. They have to ramp the system up from basically 12,000 megawatts up to 26,000 megawatts. They have to bring 14,000 megawatts of power on in 3 hours. Now, if you own a generator, and a lot of these generations in California are gas-fired. They have load-based generators. These are generators that they use throughout the day, what we call load-based, and they have peaking generators. So they have to figure out when people start coming home to start ramping all this generation up because the sun starts to go down, and guess what happens to the solar energy? It goes away. So the problem with dumping, or not dumping, but having an overproduction of solar without planning for it is you end up in this situation. Now in Hawaii, this curve has gone down below this mark here. They go to a negative pricing in Hawaii during certain days of the year because they have too much solar and they don't have a way to store it. So storage is becoming the limiting factor for renewables, not just wind, but solar as well. Now, as you probably read, California is going to, they already passed the legislation last week. All new residential homes in 2020 in California up to 3 stories have to have solar electric system in them. So now we're going to have even more solar coming into the market. And there's times here on the West Coast that the pricing actually goes negative and the utilities are paying other utilities to actually take their power from them. So let's look here at our Pacific Northwest. The thing about the Pacific Northwest is that we have more wind power than we have solar. So we're kind of the inverse of California. But that's changing. I've gone out and I've taken a look at the number of solar projects that they keep a database on. And, several years ago, 5 years ago, there wasn't a lot there. But now there's like 3 or 4 pages of projects. So wind power projects are slowing down here in the Northwest because we've got an overproduction of wind. Everybody thought, hey, we'll build this wind power, there'll be a market for it. Well, there isn't a market because California has all this solar going on the market, and the people who are buying power goes, oh, we don't need your wind power. We got more power down here we can even deal with. It's a big problem. So what's happening here in California and the Pacific Northwest is that, once again, are we adequately planning for the amount of renewable energies that are coming into the market that we can integrate into our traditional grid system? And so one of the key drivers for this has been the cost of solar. When Peninsula Light Company put the first solar system on our building, in 2006, it was $8 a watt installed. It was a 4,000 watt. 4,000 times 8 is $32,000. Today, we could put that system in for about $12,000. That's how the prices come down. We put a 65 kW system on the Harbor History Museum as part of our community solar project. It was so oversubscribed. We have so many members who wanted to invest into that system, that community solar project. We had to hold a lottery and pick the names out, to be fair. But once again, you'll see how the amount of solar installations are increasing because the cost of solar is going down. If you notice, solar is kind of flattened out a little bit. I expect it could get down to about $1.50, maybe even $1 a watt, but it's going to get more difficult to get below that. So what's the impacts to the people here in the Pacific Northwest? There's 143 utilities, public utilities in the 4-state region that buy power from BPA. BPA was always the best deal in town as far as rates. And as you can see here, Bonneville isn't the best deal in town anymore, is it? So the purple line is what we pay our preference power rate from Bonneville. As a public utility, this is our rate. And here is open market. This is spot market in the Northwest. And as you can see, it started to decline below BPA at a $1.46 projection per megawatt hour, and we're at $33.75. Now, is Bonneville the best deal in town still? Probably, because you know why? We don't have to schedule the power and we don't have to shape it. We don't have those type of people that work at Peninsula Light Company that can figure that out. So it's probably worth $10 a megawatt hour to have BPA do that for us. But what's going to happen here in the future? And that's the question that we're asking. We're all asking ourselves that here in the Pacific Northwest. We have contract with BPA that takes us to 2028. In 2006 and 7, when Bonneville was negotiating new contracts with the public utilities, they wanted a long-term contract. And we agreed to a 20-year contract. We all did. Takes us to 2028. So we're asking the question right now, is Bonneville going to be the best value for our utility in 2028? And not just Peninsula Light Company, it's all the other 143 utilities. If the power on the spot market continues to go down because of an overabundance of energy, what's going to happen in the future? We don't know the answer for that. We're kind of, measuring it as we go, but we have all these other issues with Bonneville. Are you guys familiar with the biological opinion? This young lady is. Got a gentleman back here. So hydroelectric power is a great source of renewable energy, but it has one major environmental backlash, and that's its detriment to the migratory species of salmon and steelhead on the Columbia River. In 1991, there was a court case that's been going on since 1991. The judge that started hearing the biological opinion court case eventually got senile, and they had to put another judge in there, and it's still going on. But it's finally reaching a point where they're probably forced the removal of some of the dams on the Snake River to help the migratory salmon and steelhead. This battle's been going on, 27 years? 27 years. And so for every dollar that we pay for our power, 25 cents goes to salmon. And these are all the other issues. We talked about oversupply, transmission investment. That's a big issue. I'll show you a slide here real quick as I wrap things up here. We have a power plan every 5 years. Under the Northwest Public Power Act, the Power Council has a power plan. And every power plant, as I said, is 5 years. Usually it's about 4,000 megawatts of energy savings, so they can meet all the load growth of the Pacific Northwest through energy efficiency. So just to show you how the impact is happening, Bonneville had this major transmission line they were going to build, $722 million transmission corridor from Portland up to Seattle to help relieve some congestion on the transmission system. And they had been holding public hearings for the last 5 years. And of course, who wants a transmission system going through your backyard? So you can imagine the communities up and down I-5 weren't happy about it. But as they started going through the process and things are changing, they realized they didn't need this. They went and shut this whole thing down. They could take care of the transmission congestion through energy efficiency, what we call now wireless transmission. Oh, the one other point I want to get back real quick, got to wrap this up real fast, is Bonneville's a $2 billion business. $2 billion in annual energy sales to 143 utilities and industry, and even to you folks who live here in Bainbridge. You get some of your power from BPA. If you look at your bill, there's a line item that says residential exchange. BPA sells them cheap hydro power, but they can't sell it to you at a profit. So they have to separately list it at cost. But because there's so much energy being developed out of California and the west side, they sell about $500 million a year of power to Southern California. It's now down to $200 million. So how's Bonneville going to make up $200 million? Well, rates. So now they're going to have to start raising the rates higher and higher to the public utilities to cover the loss of this oversupply of energy that's occurring. So that's how something in California impacts us all the way up here into our little utilities in our region. So this is what we're used to. You drive down your street out here anywhere. The electrical grid hasn't changed much since the 1900s, right? I mean, we've done some grid modernization, and Amy can talk about that, or she will be talking about it. But the backbone of the system that was put in, it's pretty much stayed the same all this time. And so now it's time that we look at a new business model. And this little title up here is a mantra that the CEO of Peninsula always has said since he got here. He came from Southern California. Is tomorrow's business is not business as usual. And we've been talking about that for the last 10 or 11 years, that we have to get ready for this change, because this change is coming. It's not coming, it's here. It's slowly taken force, but it's what we have to begin to address. So, that's the end.
Thank you. Thanks, Jonathan. Jonathan's the dark clouds guy, but Amy's the bright future.
Darth Vader. Well, thanks for having me today. I was pretty excited to come out here because it enabled me to look a little bit more closely at what we're doing at Penlight and moving forward. Since I got there in 2011, we have been continuously looking at how to improve our reliability. For roughly 10 years, that has included undergrounding the system, and as that's twilighting out, because we've basically hit everything that's economically feasible to underground, we're now looking at what else can we do to continue that path that we were on. And microgrids are going to be where we head next. So in addition to allowing for a different type of generation to come in and become local, the microgrid is going to allow us to also improve the reliability. And so it really has a lot of similarities to what's going on here on this island. If you look at the makeup of Penlight territory and our service and how Tacoma Power serves us, it's really similar to what you have here. Other than your transmission provider is also your distribution provider. So PSC serves your entire community. We are served by Tacoma Power on our transmission. We have very little control over that. And yet we are still impacted by decisions that they make to provide us power. So before we can really talk about microgrids, we do have to go through a little bit of a background on what is the grid as it is today. What, if you hear bulk electric grid or the bulk power system, what does that really mean? And this is what's been here for 100 years. Large generation plants. You saw one of the pictures from a hydro facility with a huge turbine. They are expensive. They are massive machines. They are all getting old, and as they get old and need replacement, very, very expensive to do that. Very costly, very time consuming, and if something goes bad unexpectedly, they go offline for quite a while, months, not weeks, not days, but typically months before it gets replaced. So as it leaves the generation facility, it goes onto the transmission system. This is also a very massive machine in and of itself. And that transmission system historically has been built up to carry the capacity to allow for generation to get to load. Travels hundreds of miles in a lot of cases before it actually gets to the load that it is going to supply that energy to. From there, it goes to your distribution substations. So on your island here, you have 3 substations around. I'm sure most of you know of it. I was just reading the PSC's website, and you must have gotten their attention because it looks like you have an entire site on their website just about Bainbridge and what they're doing for you, which was interesting. So good job, you've gotten some attention from them. But those 3 substations were built, it looks like, roughly 1980s. Now, our own substations were built even prior to that. We've modernized them over the time. But if you think about it, 1980 to 2019 coming up here, those subs are going to have to get some attention themselves. And as they do that, they're going to have to look at how to serve your load and continue to provide reliability. So those substations, as the lines leave there and come down to your homes, that's the distribution system. So every house then has a smaller transformer on it. And so all that transformation does is just convert the electricity from one voltage level to another. Voltage for long distances, you have to run it at a higher voltage to lower your losses. So as it comes down to your houses, it hits the 120 volt to 240 volt, and that's what actually serves you. So as we look into the microgrids next, we'll talk about that large system in comparison to your small systems. So as time has changed, this old system has to become very different to serve our different loads that have never historically been part of our communities. With all of these different, I think there's industrial loads, hydrogen storage, rooftop PV systems, solar systems, the wind farms all coming in. Those are all very different from an electrical perspective. They have different characteristics. They have different challenges with them. Whereas before, you had very well-known large generating facilities that all had a really similar electric characteristic. That has drastically changed. And so that change in the generation alone and then how it feeds back into the system causes a lot of challenges from just a sheer electrical engineering perspective to understand the power quality and then what that actually does for your own homes. So to date, a lot of the changes that have gone on have been relatively minor. We've used new technology. We have added in remote control of this power system. For Peninsula Light, we have 8 substations. This island has 3, but we have over 100 different SCADA sites, which means that from our dispatch center, we can remotely control and change the power flow out on the grid. A lot of the utilities in our area don't have that capability right now. So for a lot of them, when they talk about grid modernization, they're still looking at how are they going to go do that next? How are they going to, if you have a fault come down and it takes out a section of your line, how are you going to refeed around it while you go restore that? We've already started doing that. We've been doing it for about 20 years now. So we've already made that leap, and so we're looking at what happens next. And that's why we're now looking at microgrids. So now I'll get to the topic of the day, which really is, what is a microgrid? And it basically removes that bulk system, the generation, the big transmission lines, and puts it down into a local community. So the generation that is done within the community serves the community. In addition to that, you have your demand management piece of it, and then storage. And the storage right now is hands down the most difficult part. The technology just hasn't quite gotten to where it needs to be so that you can truly bring in all those renewables, store them for when the renewables are not generating, and then be able to not rely on that bulk grid. So I truly believe in the next 2 to 5 years that battery and the storage technology is going to change enough where this is going to become just a matter of fact. It's not going to be the challenge that it is right now. But in the meantime, that is hands down our greatest challenge to overcome when it comes to microgrids and being able to truly section off a smaller section and run independently for a long period of time. Demand response. Right now, does anyone have generators in their own houses? I'm guessing most of you, given that you've got 5 times the reliability concerns that we do have. So when you build those into your home, do you pick which breakers or what circuits you're going to keep on during a power outage? Typically heat, water, you probably maybe TV or your internet, but you typically don't allow your entire house onto those facilities. And so when you hear about demand management on a microgrid, that's also what you're doing. Is you are not necessarily going to be able to supply every load 100% power. You're going to probably have to pick. Now, you might be able to design a system where you can do that for a short period of time. Say it's going to be a 2 to 4 hour outage. You can probably design a system to allow for that. But if you're looking at an outage because of transmission and it's going to be weeks, you will probably have to slowly decide what loads are actually critical loads and be able to remotely control those away from that system so that you can continue to supply power for as long as you need to. So the different components of the microgrid are the generation piece. That can be distributed generation with solar, with wind, biopower generation if you have enough space to be able to do that. We just had a new facility built in our territory called Ocean 5 and Table 47, and they put in a thermal system. So they actually have a very, very low power footprint for us because their heating system is actually coming from the ground. So we were pretty excited to see that come in. We weren't really involved in it. The developer and the building owner chose to do that on their own, but we fully supported it and we're excited to see that come in. So in addition to generation, the next piece of it now is your demand management. Some of that is going to be the intelligence that you pick as you develop your own residential homes. With the electric vehicles, the actual charging mechanism has intelligence built into it at times where it can say, okay, I know that my power pricing right now is going to be cheap, go ahead and charge it. But in 3 hours, I know that my price is going to go up, so I'm going to not charge it, and I could potentially even sell back to the grid at that point, depending on that system. So as this develops, there's going to become a completely different economic system that we have not seen in the power industry yet. It's pretty exciting. There's a system in Brooklyn, New York that they've piloted with a very, very small group of people to date. They have an app on their phone, and they have their own small solar installation, and they are selling the power to each other, completely bypassing the utility altogether. They are selling energy to each other based off that pricing. They're using something called a transactive messaging and using blockchain technology. So if you haven't heard about either of those two terms yet, I can answer questions about it a little tiny bit. I'm not an expert on that area yet because it hasn't really hit our utility space. But I absolutely see that coming, especially with the new law California just passed. I could see very easily with every single home coming in having now their own generation. If you've generated more and your neighbor hasn't, being able to sell it to each other with never going through the utility is a really powerful change to our industry. And if our utilities aren't keeping an eye on what that does now, we're going to be hurting coming up here in the next 10 to 15 years. So generation, demand management, and storage. And because storage is the most difficult piece of this at this point, I've got a couple of slides here coming up where we'll talk about that a little bit more. For a system to be a large system where it's not just a single house, there has to be something called point of common coupling. Right now, for most utilities, that's technically your meter. So that is our point of delineation, point of common coupling. That's what ties your secondary system that feeds your house, that you own and manage, into our grid. With a microgrid, that point of common coupling either gets pulled out further so that it's actually on the distribution system, or it is still the meter in the case of residential solar that's now feeding back onto the grid. Point of common coupling, I think, is more the terminology that is used when it's on the physical distribution system. That is the key location where it would island off. So if you had a major outage and you did not want to be feeding your power that you've generated locally back onto the grid and you wanted to become just your own system, that point of common coupling is where that would happen. So for example, for Bainbridge, I could easily see that being either the 3 substations here or out at those 2 transmission lines that come over. That way, if they have a problem on the rest of the system, you disconnect, you go into an island mode, and now you are self-running the system locally. The electronics that are being used right now on that are industry standard, very expensive pieces of equipment. They're very complicated. They have been used for years to run the bulk electric system. So what I see as the microgrid industry changes what we've historically done is there's going to become a revolution in that where it simplifies and makes it a lot easier to be able to install this type of equipment. Hasn't happened yet, but as we see all the utilities get into this market and arena, I think we're going to see some new companies get started, or even technology companies that have never been involved in the energy industry getting involved in this to provide a completely new way of doing things. And that to me is exciting because in general, the utility industry does not like to change. The vendors that have been in this space have been in this space for 100 years, and trying to get them to use what everybody else is using, cloud-based computing, Amazon Alexa, it's really hard to make them understand that we want to see that change occur. And so as we're driving them, we're also dependent on them to make those changes. And that's where I think there's opportunity for other new companies to come into this space as our entire market undergoes a transformational shift. So energy storage at a house level, today there are opportunities that you could, for the most part, run your house. There are a lot of houses in very, very rural areas that have gone off grid. The challenge with that, especially at a local personal level, is you take on the entire expense and the entire risk. So while you may put that investment in up front, now as soon as any one piece goes down, you are 100% responsible to replace it yourself. A lot of the new microgrid projects that are going up, instead of having that risk and that initial investment placed on one person, they're spreading it across a group. And when you do that, your rate of return on investment, your payback period, all of that changes dramatically as you spread that across a group and not just on a single homeowner. So this slide shows some of the different options with the Tesla battery pack, for example. There's a number of different, Tesla obviously has the name brand right now, but there are a number of other businesses that have batteries that are being used. Most of the systems will have some type of monitoring platform available on your phone so you can see what it's doing at any given time. And then they provide the intelligence to know what loads you want on or off based off of the current pricing. Up in the Northwest, we don't typically have time of use pricing, but it's a really common way to alter energy usage in other parts of the country. So at 5 p.m., when we need a lot of power and we just haven't been able to ramp up that generation yet, the pricing could double or even triple. And in that case, you may not want to run that dryer. You might want to go ahead and set that on to do it at 2 a.m. Here, we don't really deal with it. We, for the most part, just have a set price, and so people just go about their lives as they want to. Other areas of the country have been much different in that for a very long time. This picture is an example of a very large-scale storage. I believe it's out of San Diego, Jonathan. My guess is this is probably very close to one of their substations. It is meant for a 4-hour ride through for roughly 20,000 people. So this is not necessarily for outages. If you think about it, 4 hours, it's probably going to get you through most of your outages out here. This is really meant for that duck curve that Jonathan showed for that period of time between about 3 p.m. and 6 p.m. to allow for another type of generation source, because even though batteries are not generating, they have a power capability within them that will get you through while those very large generation plants come online and start to supply the load that's needed. And these batteries, if you look at this sheer space that those require, not everyone's going to be able to put that in. And I can guarantee that that was a very expensive project. A lot of controls. If you notice the size of the workers down in here, my guess is they probably had to hire 2 to 5 full-time people just to monitor, run, install, and maintain this plant. So when you look at it from that perspective, for what they're getting out of it, it's required. They need it. And the lessons that they learned here will be able to get applied into other areas. But this is not a sustainable method either. So we still have a lot of growth in this area of storage and how we're going to use it, where we're using it, and the technology that it's using as well. So a number of the different smart grid projects and microgrids that are coming online now are using what they're calling a virtual utility. So back a year ago when Jonathan and I were looking at what we were going to do next as part of our own reliability programs, and he conceptually told me about this scheme where solar would be on residential homes, but we were connected to it and we were monitoring it and being able to control it and supplying the battery backup. We called it the virtual utility. And of course, we've turned it into an acronym. It's a VPP, the Virtual Power Plant. And basically all that means is your house is already connected to each other, whether or not you realize that or not, because the distribution grid as it is. So what the VPP will do is monitor all of those independent systems that are spread out across that system, aggregate it into a cloud-based system so that it can now see what everybody's doing as a whole, be able to know where the power is being generated versus where it's needing, and then be able to aggregate and then disperse that system. Right now, the VPP is very much under development. There's a couple of startups that have come online that are creating software to control this. It is not industry standard by any means yet. That Brooklyn microgrid project is one example of it. But because they're also allowing the sale between people, that's a very different system than some of the other ones that have come online, where there's one in Illinois with the Ameren utility, and they've put in a microgrid system that looks very similar to this with storage back at their substation. That's going to serve, I believe it was 190 homes, so not a ton of load. But they were going to be able to island off that area and serve it more or less indefinitely. A lot of the microgrids, when you hear about them, Kauai Island up in Alaska, almost all of those rural villages have been what we're now calling microgrids since they were started. But typically that generation is not renewable. Typically it's still a diesel-fired generator. So as the renewable industry changes and allows for the amount of power that we need to be available from another source, those microgrids are going to be able to adjust themselves, get off of diesel, and start using a different source of energy. But when you think in terms of what an actual microgrid is, generation, demand management, and storage, thanks. Those three things and the concept of it have been in existence for a very long time. So we're just taking something that's been proven and turning it into a completely different approach to it. So I wanted to give a couple of very specific examples. The bottom one, this Lo3 Energy, that is that transactive blockchain technology and software that the Brooklyn microgrid project's using. I'm talking about that one a lot because I think that that is what is going to be a true transformation to our industry. Kauai Island bought, back in 2002, their entire system from a investor-owned and became their own cooperative. Being an island, they do have to generate and serve entirely on their own. They are not part of that bulk electric grid. So if you want to look at a really good example of a microgrid that's been in existence since the day they started serving power, that's a great one. And then the city of Boulder, Colorado, since 2011, has been trying to work with Xcel Energy to purchase their system. They want to be 100% renewable by 2030. And they're having a hard time working with Xcel to get there. So I just saw a couple of publications that it looks like they are either going to have Xcel meet that standard, or they are going to be able to eventually take ownership of that and become their own utility to meet that goal. So keeping an eye on those three over the coming years, I think will really set some standards for the rest of the industry. This slide just has a few more examples. I mainly wanted to highlight it because this is not new. There are a lot of different projects that have either come on in the last 10 years or are coming on very recently. If you look at a lot of them, 2017, 2016, and there's a lot of other examples if you Google microgrid projects. A lot of them, what you'll find are industrial parks and hospital complexes where the entity, or schools, university campuses, where the entity actually owns the system that they've set the microgrid on. And so it's a little bit different when you look at a distribution system serving residential homes and then in comparison to those campus-based systems. Basically, you can think of the campus as just a really, really large house. in that perspective where you own your own circuitry. So they're not quite applicable to what we need to look at as a utility and serving our own members differently. So this reference sheet here, I tried to keep it at more of the applicable examples where it is still a distribution system. It's still substation, distribution, and then load, and less about those industrial university campuses and the hospital facilities. The one I think is incredibly interesting to watch is the rebuild of Puerto Rico after that storm blew through there and absolutely obliterated their system. How they are rebuilding it is pretty interesting to follow. They are putting back up that traditional grid. They're putting up the backbone, but because there are so many rural communities that have gone unserved now for months, they have stood up, mainly with a lot of nonprofit organizations going in for more social and human aid. They're standing up their own microgrids in those communities. And what they're finding is as the systems stood back up and those microgrids get connected, this last outage that they just had in April where somebody tore through a transmission line with an excavator or a backhoe, most of those rural communities had no idea the rest of the island was out of power because their system at that point of common coupling just opened up. They were able to sustain themselves, and when the transmission system finally came back up, it just reconnected, powered their batteries back up, but majority of them had no clue. So I think that's a really good example, and I think we'll see this alone change how we think about the electric system going forward. Yeah.
Are any of those examples actually already using blockchain in the distribution somehow?
Yeah, that Lo3 Energy is the one that I know of for sure with that Brooklyn microgrid. And they've got a really nice website between the two. The Lo3 is the startup company. The Brooklyn microgrid is the actual community-based project that's using it. And Lo3 uses blockchain.
Wow, Miss Wizard. Our speakers have been on time. Now is the time for discussion. So we'll have a mic that will move around in the audience, and there's a lot of changes coming for our electric utility systems. Really mind-bending kind of changes. So I imagine there'll be some questions. Ward.
Yeah, I'm from Vashon, but I share your interest through my contact with Randall and Steve. Well, I suppose there's a lot of envy in this room because you guys have your public utility well defined. Could you talk about what a disadvantage we're at being served by PSE? And certainly they'll be driven by different incentives. And how would that distort our future compared to this optimistic future that you're talking about?
I think, Jonathan's boss told him he wasn't supposed to say anything bad about PSE.
So there are two categories of utilities in Washington State. There's investor-owned utilities like Puget Sound Energy, Avista Power is one, Pacific Core. And then the other category is public utilities, municipal utilities like Seattle City Light, Tacoma, public utility districts. We've got them everywhere around us. Mason County 1 and 2, Clark County, and the third one is electric co-ops. And we always think we're kind of cooler than they are. Our community started off as a co-op because we had cooperative farming. We had co-ops for farming and fishing. So it was, kind of a way of life. And it was a form of governance that a lot of the rural communities in Washington and even in Oregon and throughout the Midwest are familiar with. So to answer your question, and I've thought about this a lot, if you look at the cooperative model, it's a voluntary organization. No one's required to join a cooperative. So when Peninsula Light started 93 years ago, not everybody in the community was on the bandwagon of, hey, let's form a cooperative. But as they went out and they started, getting membership in there and building a cooperative and building value, then the other members of the community did it as well. If you took the cooperative model and looked at it, let's say on Vashon Island, for example, you can start a cooperative in the state of Washington for about $200, and you can start building your membership, and you can start building out, if you wanted to, a microgrid, and use the local electrical distribution system as your backbone, as Amy has mentioned. It's not to say that building out a renewable microgrid system does away with your traditional grid. You can work hand in hand, but it's not going to be a confrontational situation. You're not trying to take somebody over. You have a voluntary, not-for-profit organization that's trying to promote renewable energy. And I think that's one way to look at it. Yes, sir.
The microgrid, though, if, let's say we want to do a microgrid, wouldn't we have to get some agreement from PSE? Because they have all the infrastructure. I mean, we can't, I guess it's a question. How could we do that here with PSE owning and controlling all the different components of the distribution system? Can you do that?
You want to handle that, or you want me to do it? Okay. So when you start, like as Amy's showing you some example, people aren't going large scale with this stuff. They're starting small. But at some point, the local utility, even Peninsula Light Company, has to make sure that we have the technology in place that will allow a small microgrid out in the Key Peninsula that want to intertie with us. We have to make sure that we can isolate them if there's too much energy. And Amy referred to this, it's a term called island. You guys live on an island. When you open up a circuit, you go island. And so you have to coordinate with the local utility because they have to make sure they have the protection in place to be able to integrate at that common point of coupling. So yeah, there's some planning that has to happen. But right now people are putting small-scale solar on their business and homes, but the only common point of coupling is the meter. So as you start to build something out large scale, you will have to coordinate that with your local utility.
But when I think about renewable energy, I know we're thinking about hydro, wind, and solar primarily. And has there been any good science that will tell us what in the heck is going to happen to Bonneville with climate change and the shrinking glaciers and the source of some of that hydropower? I want to know about that.
Well, that is a loaded question. You have all these folks down in Portland, Oregon, where BPA's headquarters is, and they do these load forecasts, and they do them for years. They over-projected what the load forecast was going to be for the Pacific Northwest. They were way off. So do we need as much energy as these folks in Portland thought we need? No, we don't. And as you can see, there's an overabundance of energy. I mean, if they lose those dams on the Snake River, will they be able to survive? Probably yes. If there's less flow of the glaciers start to shrink, which we already know they are, and there's less water behind the dams, will they be able to continue to provide power for the Pacific Northwest? I said I would think yes, because the one thing we have is the Northwest Public Power Council, which was set up by the Northwest Public Power Act with 2 representatives appointed by the governor from each state. They've got a huge staff of people that are keeping Bonneville in check. And when we meet with Bonneville every year, we sit in a room, our boardroom, and they have all these numbers and graphs and say, here's where we're projecting you to go. And we finally said to them 2 years ago, that's not happening. Our growth is not increasing. Our load growth, our population growth is, yes, but our load growth is going down, and you have to see that with us. Can you see what we're seeing? And it was really hard for them to change their culture. So I think if they're getting a reality check right now, believe me. They see all the load growth in the Pacific Northwest declining. We told them it was declining. They just thought it was an anomaly. Maybe this is an anomaly for a year or two, because they overbuilt a lot of generation and whatnot. So I think that in careful planning, that we learn our lessons on what's going on in California. Let's all sit back and watch what's happening in California. They got so much renewable that's going to come onto the market, and it's going to have an adverse impact because they didn't take the time to plan it out. They're just as guilty of the planners in Portland, Oregon that said you're going to need this much energy. And people are putting so much solar into the system saying, oh, so we need all this renewable energy. Yes, we do, but we need to plan it accordingly. We need to make sure that we schedule it and make sure that we have a use for it. Because if you overproduce the energy, who's going to buy it? We have to have a way to be able to integrate renewable energies, whether it's wind or solar, back into the system so that it's being used properly. And people who are capitalizing, investing on solar, whether it's you or a large-scale wind system, they're getting their money back. They're not buying a house. Remember when the recession came, people went sideways on their houses, and some people just said, I'm just going to let it go back to the bank. That's kind of a same situation that's kind of happened a little bit in the renewable market. The large-scale wind farms that were built, they're having a hard time marketing the output of those wind farms because there's too much output. And Bonneville has got all this energy in the dam, and the wind providers, and we're one of them. We finally became a generator after 85 years. We invested in a wind farm because we were forced under state law to do it, whether we needed it or not. We had to do it. And we'd say, Bono said, hey, you need to shut your wind farm down. We got too much electrons coming through the dam. But we get a production credit from the federal government based on the production of energy. So we all went to the courts, federal courts, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, and they said to Bonneville, you have to let them integrate their wind whether you need it or not. And if you don't need it, you have to compensate them for the loss of their production credit. And Bonneville said, okay, we'll abide by that. So we'll have to raise rates for everybody in the region to compensate for times when we don't need wind. Is that the most asinine thing you ever heard of? And that's the reality.
We've heard from the dark clouds guy. Amy, did you want to give us a bright future comment?
I have a point of information concerning the removal of the Snake River dams. And as a fisheries person, I'd love to see that happen. But unfortunately, the controlling interest now concerning the Snake River dams is the agricultural community, because they depend on the barges that utilize the locks that have been put on those 4 dams. And that is a huge economical activity that is going to have to be taken into consideration on the removal of the Snake River dams.
Carry on that discussion there. I asked you about this before, but have you watched that Tony Seba YouTube presentation? He would convince you that the entire transportation sector and all the energy they use is going to be shifted onto the back of the utilities. Now, if that happens, it's going to be that curve is going to go back up, isn't it?
Yeah, but we did. I promise you, I'll turn it over to Jonathan. But we did a presentation as part of this forum on electrification. I did a talk on electrification of transportation, and what we found was that if we converted all the cars, all the personal vehicles in the state of Washington to EVs, that would require about 20% of the power that we're using now. Significant, very significant, but it's not, it's not massive. It's not an absolutely massive contribution to the power load. Frankly, something that surprised me and disappointed maybe some people in the community. What we found was even if you're connected with PSE 60% fossil fuel power, you're still going to be saving about half of the carbon pollution that we would otherwise be producing in the state of Washington, because electric motors are so much more efficient. They're 95% efficient compared to a infernal combustion engine. At 25%, they're four times more efficient. So all the 75% of waste in an infernal combustion engine goes off as heat and carbon dioxide for producing that power.
I don't have anything to add. That was a good answer.
Yes.
Question for Amy. You referenced a belief that within 5 years' time, energy storage will probably scale up to the point where it's sufficient to meet demand. Could you maybe point out a couple of trends in support of that optimism?
That duck curve alone is the number one reason why I think that challenge is going to get overcome. It may not be a traditional battery storage that we know right now. It might be something else. It may not be batteries. But we will have to deal with that duck curve, and there is no traditional generation available right now outside of natural gas and the traditional types of generation. And so to be able to accommodate what everybody is doing to the system, that has to get overcome. And as we find, what I think is going to happen, and this is just me talking personally, is as the oil and gas industry realizes that this is something that the people are going to change, whether or not they like it or not, is they're going to shift their R&D focus away from their traditional methods, and they're going to now target how are we going to stay in business and continue to make money. And as soon as those businesses realize that and make that shift, and those dollars that are now going into exploration go into R&D for storage in a different format, that's why I think it's going to happen. And I do think it'll happen sooner than later, only because of what California is doing, what we're seeing in Puerto Rico. And it's not just within the U.S. too. When you look at the rest of the world, as China is growing that economy and their entire population, they have to have power needs as well. And they are not going to do it the way we've traditionally done it, because it doesn't make sense anymore. So that's why I say roughly 5 years. So.
Thank you. This has been really fascinating. I want to do a quick comment and then a question. I wanted to follow up on what Wayne was saying, is that I recently read, too, if I have this right, that some of our charming representatives in Eastern Washington actually passed a bill in the House of Representatives to block any consideration of removal of Snake River Dam. So we have got this fighting on a federal scale that is just unbelievable, and an administration ago would not have been an option. Anyway, moving forward, question for you is, I'm still trying to wrap my head around what a co-op is, and I guess I would love you to expound a little bit more on the nuts and bolts of what do you even mean when you say a co-op? It sounds like it's a nonprofit, but when you're talking about the actual structure of how it functions, how you pay people, and what you own, I guess I'm trying to understand that.
Everything's owned by the membership. So we're a voluntary organization, so you don't have to belong to the co-op. It's all voluntary. But if you want to buy power from the co-op, you have to become a member. Each member has a voting right, and there is a local board of directors annually that are up for election. We have 9 board members. 3 board members are up for election every year. So all the decisions about the co-op are made locally in the community. Rates, everything, all policies, everything is done by the co-op. Any profit or excess revenue above and beyond serving the membership is put back into the cooperative. I'll give you a good example. And from 2001 to 2009, we didn't have a rate increase. We went 8 years without a rate increase. And during that time, we were still investing pretty heavily in undergrounding our system. So there's a lot of accountability, financial accountability in electric cooperatives. we don't have to go to the UTC for anything because you have your local governing board that makes those decisions. And since it's member-owned, community-based organization, the community has a really strong sense of ownership because everybody is an owner of the cooperative. So, we have people that sometimes will say negative things about the co-op on all these social media platforms. We never say anything. We just watch our members go in and attack these people. And they love us. We do a member survey every 2 years with the National Electric Co-op Association. It's a weighted survey. And we do a member satisfaction rating on a scale of 1 to 10. And we've been coming out like around 8.98. Now, theoretically, it's impossible to get a 9. We know it'd be impossible to get a 10. But that's how much your members love the co-op, love that you're representing them in your best interest. Does that make sense?
So,
yeah. We own the whole asset would be the substations, the poles, the wires, the transformers, the headquarters building, the vehicles. Everything the co-op purchases is part of that asset.
This is great, and I worked in this industry for a long time, and with the PUDs, which serve about a third of the state, co-ops I think serve a much smaller portion of the state, but all those entities are a part of public power and the city-owned utilities, nonprofit, and so on. But the co-ops just seem to uniquely, this whole idea when PSE would talk about its economies of scale, oh my God, what would a little community do? And this community has much lower rates, 5 times better reliability, and the kind of innovation you're hearing from these people, the quality of people that they have. So, but I'll make this a question. What would a co-op do for us in the island? We've had discussions with this guy, Joel Merkel, who's had experience with a legal structure of setting one up. What would it mean here? We know that there's a city in Oregon recently established its own electric utility, city of Hermiston, but it used a co-op to operate the utility. So the city owns all those facilities, but they actually run it through a co-op. But $200 we could establish one. Maybe we ought to get together and have a meeting and have a club and kind of figure out, let's just do this for $200 and have the legal structure and then begin to worry about the things we do. But Jonathan and Amy, what could we do with that co-op here?
So you can establish a electric cooperative business model in Bainbridge Island under the Washington state law for co-ops, mutual cooperatives. It just basically article corporation bylaws, setting up your board of directors, and determining what your membership requirements are going to be, and then putting together a business plan. What's your co-op going to look like? What are your needs of your community? I can't answer that question. And what's the financial model going to look like? You're going to have to create, if you want to create a cooperative out here, a renewable cooperative, you're going to have to create a new business model, a whole new business model that's separate from the traditional business model.
How does it integrate with the grid?
What would it do? It would do a lot of things. Well, for one thing, it would bring some value to the community because you would be able to produce energy locally, and it would be governed locally. So right now when we buy renewable energy, even Peninsula Light's wind farm in Goldendale, those electrons don't come back to Peninsula Light. They just get dumped back into the Northwest grid. The thing with the microgrid is that you're creating and generating power here locally. You're in control of what your future is going to be. How you want to formalize that, I don't know.
I think what Steve was asking, how do you creep up on PSE?
You don't creep up on them. There's no need to creep up on them. It's like a. Well, I even hate to say it would be almost like a passive aggressive sort of thing, but you don't have to go to them and say, we're not going to take over your system. We don't want it. It's old. If we bought it, we'd have to pay too much money for it. We'd have to invest millions into bringing it up to current standards. Why would you want to waste your time doing that?
Yeah, but what would be the first step?
Well, do you want to discuss that now and here?
So I just returned from the Coachella Valley in California. Southern California Energy is now offering deeply discounted BMW electric cars to their customers. So this is just something that is an adaptation by the traditional power companies to the new environment. And I thought I was stunned to see it. I think it was 10,000 off or something. Huge.
You know, more than likely why they're doing that is that curve, that battery storage, they have to have a way to store all of this energy so that you can use it across a levelized field. So more than likely, it wasn't because they want people driving EVs. It's because they have to deal with the solar and the renewable energies coming in. And that is one way to ensure that they're going to have something at every house that has a solar to now store that power for use later. So it'll be interesting as they see what the as they analyze that and see what effects that has on that duck curve, if it really does try to start to stabilize and levelize that, and if that actually does anything to it or not.
Popped into my brain one additional comment to your question. I think if it's true, as you suggested, if it's 80% of the energy consumed in the life cycle of an electric vehicle is in the manufacturer, we need to change those damn manufacturers over to renewable power. So, yeah.
Too.
So
I just want to ask you a follow-up question on that, because if you're saying that these companies are using electric vehicles as a potential for storage, don't you need an infrastructure that actually supports that? Like, I plug my electric vehicle in at night, but it can't store for the grid. I mean, we're not set up that way. So you have to have a different infrastructure in place, don't you?
Yeah, the control so that the house knows the price of power on the market versus what kind of storage you have and what kind of generation you have to now basically arbitrate all of that real time, feeding it all back up to a centralized source to make really intelligent, complex decisions. It's really cool, and that's where we're going to see a major change in our industry. And our challenge as a utility is our own workers that go out and build the system and are part of our decision-making process don't see this happening because they've been doing the same thing for 50 years. And so we, as well, internally have to educate our own employees about how this change is coming and how it's going to affect their day-to-day business as well. So it's because it's taking intelligence that used to solely exist at our distribution centers, and it puts it into every single person's home and smartphone. And that is a huge shift. So.
thank you all for coming. I wish there had been more of them, more of you that came, but you'll notice that we've been videoing this, so it'll be on our website. And tell your friends that the presentations will be there. Laura insisted that we have, at the end of each one of these presentations, actions that we recommend considering. She gave me the first two to fill in, and of course what I said was, let's consider how a virtual utility might work on Bainbridge Island, and what are the alternatives to our polluting, expensive, and unreliable utility provider. We've had a community conversation over the last 2 years about municipal power. Let's broaden our thinking to other potential solutions to a world that doesn't rely on fossil fuels. And please spread the word about this forum. We're going to be taking the summer off so that people can enjoy their summers. In October, we're going to have a new series of discussions, and we hope that you and your friends will all come. And with that, I think we want to give appreciations to Eagle Harbor Congregational Church. Herb has the donation bucket there. They ask us to drop something in the kitty. We get this space for free. Thank you very much for that donation to them. Again, our 5 organizations that sponsored this forum: Island Power, Climate Action Bainbridge, Sustainable Bainbridge, EcoAdapt, and Citizens Climate Lobby. Brian Anderson runs our website. John McKenzie is our video guy. Jonathan White and Amy Grice. Please, another round of applause for our speakers. Thank you.